Donald Fraser was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, on March 15, 1882. Sometime in his 20s, Fraser, along with many other men he would meet in his battalion, left Scotland to seek his fortune and settled down as an accountant in Calgary. When England entered the war in Europe, patriotism to England spread rapidly through Canada. As a dominion of the British Empire, Canada was bound to the fate of the British war effort. Almost immediately, cities began raising their own battalions for the war. Fraser answered the call of duty and swore his allegiance to King George V and the British Empire on November 24, 1914. Donald Fraser was now a private in the 31st Calgary Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Fraser began recording the experiences and events of his service soon after arriving in Belgium. Inspired by his friend Percy Crane, he decided to start a journal of his own, despite the fact journal keeping was against regulations. When he had time, he would record the events of the day. However, major battles, long stints in the trenches, and the grueling business of war prevented him from writing daily. His service to Canada ended when he was wounded at Passchendaele in November 1917. He found the time to complete the gaps in his journal while in hospitals in France and England, before being discharged from service on September 16, 1918. Fraser described his journal as nothing more than a running story of our daily movements and observations, supplemented with accounts of happenings and sprinkled with comments and grousings. What is written here is more or less the common experience of thousands of soldiers. In those experiences, Fraser detailed the carnage of battle, the fears of his comrades, and the ways in which soldiers kept fighting amid the horrors of trench warfare. Arriving in France on September 8, 1915, Fraser soon became familiar with one of the most important stimulants of the war. Billeted in French houses before arriving at the trenches, Fraser wrote of the delicious coffee given to him by civilians. In its class, the coffee was the best, and every soldier who has been in France has pleasant memories of those little bowls of coffee and slices of French bread. They proved so often to be a stopgap to hunger when our commissariat broke down. While in Belgium a month later, Fraser and his battalion learned that almost every house in Belgium would supply the soldiers with eggs, bread, and coffee. These were often served, however, in the typical Belgian fashion, plain and not too clean. Apart from its filling attributes, coffee provided flavor to the mundane diets of trench rations. It gave energy to soldiers deprived of sleep. It kept the mind sharp when in the line. It warmed the body on frigid mornings. Coffee was a practical supplement to the fighting men when food alone could not sustain them. Coffee in the First World War was practically universal in the rations of all the belligerent countries. On the Eastern Front, hot black coffee felt like redemption to the undertrained Austrian troops advancing against the Russians. On the Southern Front, Italian troops on patrol noted how Austrian troops prepared and enjoyed coffee at the same time and in the same way Italians did. No other warring country in the First World War placed a greater importance on coffee than Germany. Coffee was so ingrained in the German diet that a war committee for coffee, tea, and substitute goods was established to balance coffee rations on the home front and on the war front. Although British and Canadian troops were familiar with coffee's resuscitating effects, tea replaced coffee in British troops' rations. Though both tea and coffee were adored by British and Canadian soldiers alike, no beverage served to the troops revived the fighting spirit quite like rum. For several months before the Canadian offensive at the Somme, Fraser worked for the quartermaster as a packer, one who delivers supplies to dumps behind the front lines. On one strenuous occasion in May 1916, Fraser was tasked with bringing a couple of rum jars to the soldiers in the line. The rum was contained in ceramic jugs, either 1 or 2 gallons, marked SRD. Officially, the SRD stood for Supply Reserve Depot, though Fraser and the rest of the battalion referred to the rations as service rum diluted. Since rum could be dangerous left alone with soldiers in the trenches, Fraser left the rum in the hands of his major, who alone could distribute rum rations, or tots, to the men. Each man would receive from his commander a half gill of rum, either in the morning or evening. Daily allotments of alcohol were not unique to the British rations, but British rum was famous for its potency, quality, and effect on troops. Parts of the Canadian Expeditionary Force were famous for their partiality towards liquor, specifically the 42nd Royal Highlanders Battalion, composed of mostly Scots and commonly known as the Black Watch of Canada. One day, after a marvelous discovery of a jar containing rum, Fraser wrote, "To be left in the trench by such a Scottish element as the 42nd, under existing climactic conditions, is enough to upset all current theories regarding Scotsmen and the drink question." Rum held a special place in the hearts of Commonwealth soldiers who fought in the war. Lieutenant Colonel J.S.Y. Rogers, medical officer to the Black Watch, wrote, "Had it not been for the rum ration, I do not think we should have won the war. Before the men went over the top, they had a good meal and a double ration of rum and coffee." Fraser often spoke fondly of the rum ration and its effects on the common soldier in the trenches. Time and again, it has come to the rescue, and many owe their freedom from colds, rheumatism, and kindred troubles to the timely inward application of this liquor. Rum rejuvenated exhausted soldiers in the mornings and got the blood flowing. It was a relief to soldiers with grueling jobs, such as stretcher bearers and lookouts. It was a depressant that calmed the minds of men on sleepless nights. Above all else, rum was used to give soldiers Dutch courage and the fearlessness to go over the top. On July 4, 1916, Fraser grew tired of his job as packer and returned to the trenches, 2 months before the Canadian offensive at the Somme. This would be the third major engagement for Canada in the First World War and would be the first time Canadian troops were on the offensive. On the night of Thursday, September 14, 1916, Fraser and the rest of the 31st Battalion waited in the muddy trenches, chilled by rain and kept on edge by falling mortars. At 3:30 a.m., the order was given to move to the front lines. Fraser wrote what he saw. "No man's land badly furrowed and scarred afforded fairly firm shooting, but the innumerable shell holes and general unevenness of the surface foretold difficulties in crossing." At 0 hour, on Friday, September 15, 1916, the Canadian mortars commenced the barrage and the assault began. As Fraser and the rest of the 31st went over and made their way across the 300-yard expanse to the German trenches, the atmosphere was cracking with a myriad of machine gun bullets, startling and disconcerting in the extreme. Men were falling all around, the wounded writhing in their agony. Fraser had taken cover in a shell hole, dodging bullets and the falling corpses of his comrades now piling up around him. Feeling as though he had lost all sense of time, Fraser thought the assault had failed until reserve troops led by a massive tank broke through the German line. Once in the German trenches, Fraser stumbled upon a jar of German white rum. He recalled that it was greatly appreciated, but for taste, strength, or quality, it was no match for the SRD. The white rum Fraser found was a bad omen for the German soldiers who originally received it, aware that rum was only served when major attacks were imminent. Sweeping through the trenches for remaining enemies, Fraser happened upon a Canadian who had also found some German rum and was now happy as could be, singing like a bird. Because the rum rations were strictly monitored by command, soldiers could find enough liquor to get properly drunk only after finding a jar in an enemy trench or being a friend to a corrupt commander. Had Fraser and the rest of his battalion not been given a double tot of rum and coffee before the assault on the German lines, the outcome would have been much more devastating. A sober soldier may have looked upon no man's land and would have lost all faith in his courage and in his cause. Rum gave the men the Dutch courage they needed to leave their trenches and face death head-on. In a war where the inherent morality of the human condition was challenged daily, rum was the fuel that propelled men into hell. 6 days after the Somme, Fraser and a pal visited the town of Canaples, feeling as though they required a pick-me-up. That night, the two of them indulged in a mixture of hot coffee and rum. To Fraser, it was a bit of all right.